Welcome. In this video, we're going to begin our exploration of our next philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I have asked you to read selections from his essay called The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. So I thought to get the ball rolling, I would introduce you a little bit to first who the man Jean-Jacques Rousseau was, and then try to get us a little bit of a sense for what is going on in this rather difficult piece of writing. Okay, so just as a bit of background, Rousseau is associated with the French Enlightenment. He is born in 1712, spends a lot of his early life in relative poverty, and eventually, although he was not particularly known to have been a great student or anything like this, he chances upon an essay competition at the Académie de Dijon in 1750, and he enters into the contest with an essay called Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, and he wins the top prize of the competition. And apparently, this piece kind of launched him to a kind of celebrity status in French society at the time. And it was a very withering critique of the Enlightenment and a very withering critique of modern European society. Rousseau ultimately argues there that the arts and sciences are kind of like a smokescreen for wider social injustices that are being committed by European imperial society. So Rousseau has kind of become something of an infamous critic, actually, of the Enlightenment, and he would eventually become associated with the French Revolution. Above all, Rousseau is a critic of inequality, as we'll come to understand in this piece. And the French Revolution, at bottom, was propelled by the social inequalities of wealth that were existing in French society at the time. Um, Now, we're not going to be reading the first discourse, the discourse on the arts and sciences, but we are going to be reading his follow-up, kind of a sequel he wrote in 1754. And this is famously now referred to as the second discourse, or kind of the second essay, as it were, that made his name. And it's called Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. So interestingly enough, Rousseau did not win the essay competition this time around, although I think pretty good case could be made that it's this second essay that is more important and more compelling and at least more influential. So just to get a little bit into the weeds here, or rather to at least get some orientation of what the piece is about, you will notice that Rousseau is in fact responding to a specific question from the Academy of Dijon here, appearing right here on page 37. I would just kind of flag this in your book and mark it as the prompt, as it were. It's as though he's a student like you, and he's getting a kind of an assignment to deal with here. And the question you'll notice is, what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? We're going to have to think about this term, natural law. What is it? What does it mean for something to be natural law? And this is a strange question, right? What is even being asked? What is the origin of inequality among men? And is it authorized by natural law? Certainly, you will never have to respond to a prompt like this in one of your own papers. So we're going to have to think a little bit about what is even being required of Rousseau to think about here. I think a way of entering into it is to kind of argue, or to kind of think about the birth of inequality. If we think about contemporary American society, let's take our minds out of French society, we can see all kinds of inequality in the culture, right? There's inequality of economics. Some people have tons of money, some people are homeless. We can see inequality of access to all kinds of necessary institutions, things like education, right? Access to healthcare. We can see inequality in terms of gender, perhaps. Men are typically positioned to have relative power over women, and women are still marginalized or excluded from professional life to a degree, right? So there are all these kinds of inequalities in the culture. And the question I think that we're dealing with here is, where do they come from? What is their source? Can we track them back to some kind of original idea or some original event that may have happened in human history? Are they a product of human nature? I think that's really kind of the idea here behind natural law. If something is a natural law, if it's a law of nature, it would seem to imply that there just are perhaps unequal people out there in the world by nature. Some people are just kind of a more fit type, and then there's a maybe a mid fit type, and then a low fit type. If that's our explanation, then it seems to um, sort of imply that inequality in the culture is as natural as the law of gravity. It's just kind of in the nature of humanity to be unequal. Rousseau is going to be pretty skeptical of that explanation, and he wants to try to think about alternative origin stories of modern inequality. And you'll pick up pretty quickly that he really hates inequality. He is deeply sympathetic to the basic suffering that inequality in modernity brings about to marginalized peoples. And he tends to think that Europe and the West in general is deeply hypocritical about the unequal world that it is so keen on kind of exporting to other populations like indigenous people in the Americas. And I think the question actually was born of early encounters with Native Americans, let's say, people who did not seem to have such rigid hierarchies as Europeans. Um, and it's also important to bear in mind that the context within which Rousseau is writing is one in which enlightened French society, high society in particular, is deeply hierarchical. If you were to enter a party or any other kind of salon in French culture, just based on the dress and the language and the manner of presentation, everybody knew how important and how wealthy and how prestigious everyone else was. People wore their social rank, as it were, on their sleeve. It was a very hierarchical and kind of class centric society. And Rousseau really resented and had contempt for that social reality. So that will be a kind of the red thread of the whole piece. Rousseau's contempt for inequality and his suffering for those who are bearing the brunt of an unequal social world. Okay. Now, just to backtrack a little bit here in the preface, there are some interesting methodological points that Rousseau raises that differentiate his approach to the study of human nature from Hobbes. And you will notice that Rousseau is pretty keen on criticizing Hobbes at almost every step of the way in the discourse. He will argue that Hobbes is wrong about human nature, and Hobbes is therefore wrong about politics and about sovereignty and the social contract. All right, so we'll see that recur throughout the discourse. But let's just have a look at the preface and kind of set up Rousseau's first sort of response to the question. He writes, "Of all the branches of human knowledge, the most useful and the least advanced seems to me to be that of man." So the study of humanity, he's saying, is the least advanced. It seems to be a bad study, a bad discipline. And I dare say that the inscription of the temple at Delphi alone contained a precept more important and more difficult than all the huge tomes of the moralists. Thus, I regard the subject of this discourse as one of the most interesting questions that philosophy is capable of proposing. And unhappily for us, one of the thorniest that philosophers can attempt to resolve. For how can the source of the inequality among men be known unless one begins by knowing men themselves? So think about the problem that Rousseau is sort of approaching here. He's making this reference to the temple at Delphi, right? This reference to Plato with the inscription that very famously bears the mantra "Know thyself." Right? Philosophy has all been sort of in the business of critical, ruthless self-investigation into the self, into the nature of the soul. Now we have here in modernity Rousseau telling us that perhaps we don't have such a clear path into self-knowledge, that maybe we're actually incredibly ignorant of our own true nature, our true essence, right? So he writes, and how will man be successful in seeing himself as nature formed him through all the changes that the succession of time and things must have produced in his original constitution, and in separating what he derives from his own wherewithal, from what circumstances and his progress have added to or changed in his primitive state, like the statue of Glaucus, which time, sea, and storms had disfigured to such an extent that it looked less like a god than a wild beast. The human soul, altered in the midst of society by 1,000 constantly recurring causes, by the acquisition of a multitude of bits of knowledge and errors, by changes that took place in the constitution of bodies, by the constant impact of the passions, has, as it were, changed its appearance to the point of being nearly unrecognizable. Okay, so Rousseau is invoking, I think, this very beautiful image of the statue of Glaucus, this god that has emerged from the sea and is all kind of eroded and distorted. And it's kind of functioning as a metaphor for humanity. Humanity has been distorted, so bent out of its original condition that we no longer even have a clear representation of human being, right? What does he attribute to all this distortion and this degradation in our nature? He seems to add a few clues here. Things like the midst of society, something in the nature of our social institutions perhaps has degraded us. He says maybe the acquisition of certain kinds of knowledge. It's interesting, but Rousseau will tend to be a skeptic of knowledge as progress. He will not always be equating knowledge with progress in the way that perhaps Socrates did, right? By changes that took place in the constitution of bodies. So our body, our natural body, has changed over time. And I want you to be aware of how Rousseau is not a static thinker when it comes to human nature, the changes from the original natural condition to civil society. He thinks of humanity as an evolving process of adaptation and change. And much as nature itself changes, human beings and their bodies actually change according to what we have to adapt to over time. And he'll be deeply critical of the way the body has transformed into a more passive and docile body in the modern world as against the adroit and fit and strong body of nature. By the constant impact of passion, so something in our emotional or passionate life is distorting us. And instead of being active always by certain and invariable principles, instead of that heavenly and majestic simplicity whose mark its author had left on it, one no longer finds anything but the grotesque contrast of passion, what thinks it reasons and an understanding in a state of delirium. Something is very negative about modern humanity for Rousseau. So Rousseau is definitely here, I think, showing his cards a little bit as critic of modern humanity. And as we will see, he will be contrasting that with an original humanity, which he views very favorably, very, very positively. Okay. Um, there's a few more details here in the preface, but I just want you to sort of note this idea of humanity as process and as transformation and as perhaps descent over time. Rousseau clearly thinks that we have lost touch with something, and what that something is will be the topic of the first part of the discourse. Um, so now Rousseau, after the question in part one, will try to get a little bit more specific with the concepts regarding inequality in order to answer the question whether or not the origin of inequality is authorized by natural law. He says we need clearer and more distinct terminology in order to answer the question, right? So he says, kind of right off the bat here from part one, this is on page 37, that there's not just one inequality that we're talking about, there's really two. All right. So he says, I conceive of two kinds of inequality in the human species. One which I call natural or physical, because it is established by nature and consists in difference of age, health, bodily strength, qualities of mind or soul. The other may be called moral or political inequality, because it depends on a kind of convention and is established, or at least authorized, by the consent of man. This latter type of inequality consists in the different privileges enjoyed by some at the expense of others, such as being richer, more honored, more powerful than they, or even causing themselves to be obeyed by them. Okay, so let's just hover over those two terms for a moment here. The first concept is natural or physical inequality, which seems to refer to like our natural endowment, the stuff that we're born with, things like our strength, our fitness, our health, perhaps our intelligence, right? Things that are kind of just the roll of dice, the roll of the dice of nature, as it were. Maybe that roll of the dice is a fair dice and we're pretty much equally distributed in terms of those natural traits. Maybe the roll of dice is loaded and some people are just more fit than others, right? So that's natural and physical. And if we are going to argue that the origin or the source of inequality is a natural or physical source, it would seem to answer the question in the affirmative. We would be saying that inequality is authorized by natural law because human beings, under this argument, and I'm not saying that this is Rousseau's argument, but if this is true, we would be saying that inequality simply stems from the natural inequality of human traits, right? Some people are smarter and stronger and they kind of rise to the top of the chain, and others are perhaps less well positioned to fight in the struggle for survival. Okay, so that's the first option. And the second he calls moral or political, which I tend to language and I tend to think of as being basically social inequality. He says that this is inequality that is established by convention. That is, it's stuff that we have contrived through our institutions, through our social relations, through our history, perhaps through our culture. It's things like privilege, material inequality. It's things like being more honored, right? It's like prestige and importance. It's about power, and it's also about relations of obedience and submission to authority, right? And so Rousseau seems to be saying we need to hold that type of inequality apart from natural and physical inequality. So if the answer to the question is going to be the latter, that is, if it's going to be moral or social inequality, the answer to the question would be in the negative, right? It would seem to suggest that inequality is not authorized by natural law because if we are saying that inequality is the product of the consent of human beings over time, we're not really saying anything about whether or not that consent is natural or legitimate for that matter. So try to think about the implications of those two concepts, right? If one wants to advocate for a natural or physical inequality, a society that is derived or grounded in a natural or physical inequality, think about what consequences follow that for political life, right? It would suggest that we can't really change inequality, right? We're sort of stuck with an unequal human nature that is inevitably going to fashion an unequal world. But alternatively, if we say that inequality is not natural, but rather is social or moral, it has very different implications for the society we want to live in. It would suggest that perhaps inequality does not have to be produced, right? That we could live in a world that looks very different and perhaps is not unequal. And I think you can already imagine that Rousseau is going to be opting in favor of the second option, right? He is going to come down rather hard in the negative. He is going to be critic of the authorization of inequality on the basis of natural law. Okay, so that's essentially the problem, and it is the terrain in which Rousseau is going to be operating throughout the discourse. The next sort of wing or section of text in the first part of the essay will be a return to the natural condition in much the same manner as we got it in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Uh, However, Rousseau is going to criticize Hobbes's concept of the state of nature as a state of individualistic competitive violence, and will give us a very different idea of what the state of nature probably looked like. And he's going to, from that basis, then try to sketch out a long process of evolutionary history, which portrays the human being as essentially damaging and corrupting this original natural condition and entering the relations of civil society that made the unequal world that we still currently inhabit. Okay, so for the next reading, pay close attention to what Rousseau means by the state of nature and try to get a feel for what that natural condition was like and why it is ultimately a positive condition, and contrast it in your mind with Hobbes's negative picture of human nature. And perhaps think about in this debate between Hobbes and Rousseau, who you believe has a stronger argument about the state of nature, which story is a more plausible story about the natural state. And then we can try to come to some conclusions about the answer to the essay question in part two. Okay, thank you. Continue with the readings, and we will pick up the conversation with Rousseau's description of the state of nature next time.